Hello, guys. How you doing? This is JP Saricolia coming to you once again with another episode of Age of Heroes, my podcast. Good morning here in the U.S. and good afternoon some other parts of the world. Good evening. And today I want to discuss about comics. I want to talk particularly on the age gap, does it really matter? Is it that important? The age gap, the age divide. As you know, with comics, there is a long history in comics. Long history for over 80 years or more. Comics have been a very intrinsical part, a very important part of the upbringing of many children throughout many generations. It has changed entertainment. It's something that even though comics as we know them, they've been probably like 85, 90 years, 75 years. Even beyond that, before that, comics were already popular in the 1800s. As you know, the cartoons or the little comics that came out of newspapers or little magazines would actually they were very political. They talk about the life, about a lot of things, the social issues that were happening during that time. Of course, they develop into comics as we know them. That primarily at the beginning was more for a market for children. But of course, that has evolved up in recent years. Pretty much in the past 20, 25 years, it has become more than just a medium for entertainment only for children. The market has changed where the vast majority of the readers are older. You're looking at an older generation that grew up with comics and they still read comics, and they're the ones that the biggest buyers. Primarily, there's a big number of males reading comics more than females, although there's a big number of women reading comics, but the vast majority has always been men. And of course, nowadays comics are more geared towards that male audience, primarily an older audience. So you see more mature content within comics. But there's an age gap, and what I'm talking about today about the age gap, also talking not only necessary about this case the people that are buying comics. I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm talking about this age gap between the different generations that have read comics and how their interpretation of comics or how the perception of comics affects the way comics are being received nowadays, and what people prefer over other people and so on and so on. So I want to explore that today. I want to discuss that today because it does really matter. It really makes it has an effect on the way people perceive comics, whether from this generation, from the previous generation, from the generation that was before that. As you know, throughout those many years, I would say 75, 80 years of comics, there's been different generations. When we talk about comics, and nowadays we talk about the different eras of comics, the modern comics. You have the golden age of comics. And then all of this is, in regards to comics as we know them from this pre-modern generation, superhero comics primarily. You have the golden age of comics. You have the silver age of comics. You have, of course, the bronze age of comics and the dark age of comics as some people know it. There's also the modern age of comics. So we have different generations. Of course, for those that are not as familiar, the golden age of comics is anything that happened, pretty much at the beginning. You're looking at anything prior on the 30s, 40s, 50s, all during that time within the, around the same era of the World War II or prior to World War II. And during that time, of course, you saw companies like Atlas Comics. I think it was Atlas or Timely. It was Timely Comics. And companies that, national before DC, companies that primarily they produce a lot of stuff that has to do with, sci-fi, and there was a lot of westerns, and there were a lot of different comics during that time that, they were very popular. Superhero stories were a bit popular during the Golden Age. There were great Golden Age creations, during that time. You saw the creation of Captain America, creations of Batman, Superman. Those are the Golden Age of comics. Those was a different time. Shazam. Those are great stories from that era. And after that, of course, we understand that the Silver Age of comics, which actually define comics as we know it modernly. That's the creation, of course, after Atlas became Marvel. Of course, you see the first family, you see the Fantastic Four, you see the Justice League of America, you see all those in the era. This is you're looking at the 60s and the 70s, a time where there was a big development in comics, the growth of comics, superhero comics during that time. You're looking at the pretty much the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all during that time. Definitely it was a fantastic time, a lovely time for comics. A lot of that was pretty much the rise of Marvel Comics and also the big competition between Marvel and DC. Now, you look at the Bronze Age, is technically, it happens in the 70s, and pretty much during that time, you see pretty much comics getting a little more serious. Bronze Age of comics, you see, for many, it was the dead, of course, Gwen Stacy. You see a lot of great stories during the Bronze Age of comics. You see situations like, of course, Batman by Adams, by O'Neill. Phenomenal stories during that time. You see, you can keep going throughout the process of Marvel, DC, so many stories from the Bronze Age, to which I love. I love the Bronze Age. Sal Buscema's Hulk, and so on and so on and so on. And after that, of course, the Dark Age of comics for many is when comics became, in the 80s, became darker. You see stories like many consider the Dark Knight Return, the Batman Returns, or Dark Knight Returns. I just always get confused. For many, that was the beginning of the end for comics. It was a different time. Comics became a bit darker. Some people mentioned that even before that, there were more darkness within comics. It marks a contrast in the way comics were created. You also see more darker tones. You see Watchmen. You see stories like V for Vendetta. You see a darker tone in comics, and primarily DC was at the center of it, pushing the envelope. And of course, that Dark Age of comics kind of progressed, and has been up till now. Although now it's more, I would say, we're no longer in that Dark Age. It's more, we are kind of like at the end of the Dark Age of comics. We don't know exactly what's going to happen next, but the comics have changed. Of course, there's a new evolution. There's a new generation. People love older teams, but of course, most of the readers nowadays are older, so it's normal for them to read, to prefer things that are a bit more older, or more mature in content. Now, the generation that you grew up with, the generation that you grew into, will define the type of comics you prefer, and the stories you like, the art that you like, and the writers that you like. Every time you go into any stories or any comics nowadays or anything, and even in my videos, I notice this, and people make comments about the things they like and things that they don't like. Some people don't like the Bronze Age of stuff. Some people don't like the older stuff. They prefer the newer stuff. And some people, you're always going to hear throughout the comments and throughout reviews, some people say, well, I don't like this era of comics because the comics were too wordy. People make so many, the writers, they spend so much time writing or commenting about certain things, or they use these big words and these big conversations, and some people prefer just the visuals. Some people say, well, I don't like too many words, I like visuals. And or some people are like, I prefer just you prefer small panels. Some people prefer big panels, all of that. Some people say, well, I don't like the newer artists because everything is just pretty much a pin-up art. It's just big splashes and that's all it is. There's emptiness. There's no pretty much a visual reference for, to go through the story. Some people, don't like the older stuff because they saw so many different blocks, particularly when you divide the pages into this, 9 classic panel. They don't like the panel layout, but the other people hate the new panel layout. And every time people talk about it, there's always going to be this battle, and there's always this divide between fans, and everything actually, no one is really satisfied with something, with one thing or the other. And at the middle of it, at the core of everything, is just the age divide. It's the generational divide, which really marks what people prefer. If you grew up in a pretty much in a bygone era, you grew up in the 70s or before that, or you grew up even in the early 80s, there was a different time in comics, where primarily generation was totally different from the generation of today. Writing was an important part of that time. The reading was an important part of that time. I grew up in the 80s, in the early 80s. I grew up, I was born in the 70s, in the late 70s. To me, as a child, reading was an intrinsic part of my upbringing. But it's not because I'm a reader, or because I'm, better than anybody else reading. No, it's because it was part of our generation. As I remember growing up, nowadays, of course, it's totally different. But back in the day, there was no social media. There was no, even there was no cable TV. You just watch whatever was on TV, which was not really much. The cartoons didn't only play cartoons until Saturday morning, or you had cartoons in the evenings throughout the Monday through Friday, but that was it. Primarily there was nothing else, and sometimes there was only a television at home. So that means that even there were cartoons in the evening, you wouldn't watch the cartoons because maybe your parents will watch the TV, or your mother will like to watch, in my case, her novelas, telenovelas, as a Hispanic thing. And she would like to watch the soap operas, which that's what telenovelas are. And that was it. So that means that you will pretty much you have to suck it up. There was nothing else to do. So what do? What you did, like most kids, you go out and play, or, you simply go and read comics. If the weather is not good, if you're not allowed to go out, then you read comics. Not only comics, you read books. My father was a big believer in reading books, so he always pushes to read books. So we read a lot. And growing up in that environment, reading was an important part of our lives. So reading comics that we now are considered wordy, or writers are wordy, it was nothing new. It was part of life. It was part of understanding. It was entertainment. We read to understand, what's happening. It was the way we entertain ourselves. We love the stories. It was part of growing up. Of course, nowadays it's different. We live in a visual world where our kids are growing up with iPads. Pretty much they're born and they already know how to use it. They're 1-2 years old, already know how to use an iPad. We give them iPads for them to kind of play. So for them, everything is visual. They visualize everything. This young generation, this millennial generation that now lives, for them, visuals are important. For them, visuals, speaks louder than words. It is their culture. It is their lifestyle. It is how they do things. So, of course, they get bored very quickly reading old books, or old comics, because they feel that there's no value in it, because it's too slow paced for them. They want things to go fast. They want to grab a book, a comic book, open a few pages and kind of finish the story to move on to the next thing, maybe just to look at their Instagram or their Snapchat. It's just the way it is. And I'm not trying to say this to fault our new generation. Anybody that has grown probably in the 90s, not even in the 80s, in the 90s, in the late 90s, in the 2000s, for them it's just business as usual. This generational gap, I'm not trying here to, denigrate them or make them feel that they were less, and they're just not as smart as people from the past, because that's not the case. Every person is different. We all the same. We just our brain operates in a different way. Our likes are different. Our based on our upbringing, are based on the generation we grew up, because times were different then and times are different now. And that determines what you like and what you dislike, and determines the way you like things and the way you don't like things. There's a lot of things that of my generation I prefer. And there's a lot of things I dislike about the new era, the new times. How adapt to a lot of things. For example, I can tell you one thing. I hate Twitter. I understand a little bit of Twitter, but it's always hard for me to keep up with Twitter. And even though Twitter's been around for so long, I just find it so hard for me to try to express my ideas in a single note, in a couple of, sentences and just let it go. It's just hard for me to do that because I'm a writer, I'm a reader. I'm a person that I prefer long ideas. I prefer people that express their ideas, that take time to express how they feel, and we live in the Twitter generation where everything has to be expressed in just one single note. For me, it's more about express that in a paragraph, I'm just a writer. Even at work, people sometimes say, I work with a lot of people, and a lot of people in my job are very young, and they say, man, you're very wordy when when you send this email. So when you send that, you express this in a long sentences. And, it's just who I am. It's just because it's part of my generation. Of course, I'm dealing with people that are half my age. And for them, it's just different. It's hard for them to click, the idea of why you do this and why you do that. Of course, I'm a writer by nature. I love to write. But at the same time, to me, it's okay to express ideas. I feel that people need to be more specific about what they write. That's why I prefer older comics, in my opinion. That's just me, because I love when ideas are expressed, and they're expressed openly and, explore. And that's why I prefer to read. That's why I consider Watchmen one of the best books of all times in comic books, because it really, in this case, they took their time, to really express, through not only through visuals, but primarily through words, which makes it a beautiful, beautiful book. Alan Moore really took its time to really create and really, really develop the story, to embellish the story through all his writing, which makes it a phenomenal book. Other people, young generations, might read it and get bored on the first chapter because it's too much for them. But yeah, you give them anything that is new and is compressed and it's just close and they love it. That's one of the reasons I hate much of the writing today. Although I read some comics, a lot of people love Grant Morrison and they love the older stuff. One of the things I don't like about Grant Morrison, and Grant Morrison has adapted his writing. If you go back and read, the things that he did before, like, the Doom Patrol, or you read stuff like, the other stuff that he did prior to any of the newer stuff, you're going to realize that there is that difference in his writing. His writing nowadays is more compress, and writers adapt so they can sell the product to the new generation. It's more compressed. It's not as big as it used to be, but it's more adapted to this young generation that just wants things and ideas quick, the Twitter generation. So to me, that's the part where it always leaves me hanging when I write his stuff, when I read his stuff. I'm sorry, because when I read it, I just feel that it's just not it's not giving me a full idea for me to really care much about the story. But I don't want to discuss about Grant Morrison here on this pretty much podcast, but I'm talking about, it gives you an idea. And writers adapt their stories to cater to that generation that they're writing for. And it's okay. It's just a livelihood. You are doing your job, and your job is just to cater and to entertain the people that pay for your books, to pay to read your books. And it's just business as usual. But there's a generational divide that separates that generation from this generation and marks that. And that's the way people see things. For example, I was watching yesterday, of course, probably you saw or watched my video impressions of the new trailers for Spider-Man Far From Home. And, I go through I love to read the comments, through YouTube. And, there's a lot of people that are loving this. Not many people are hating it. But what really surprised me, I even went to the forums. In the forums, people are expressing what they like about that. But it really amazed me that everyone loved it. And it was a great, actually, the trailer was good. It was geared towards every generation. It really gives something to every part of every person that loves Spider-Man, because you see the addition of the elementals. So anybody that grew up in the old generation understand the elementals. So understand, of course, Mysterio, Hydra Man, In this case, Sandman, all of that, it brings back, even Molten Man, all of that, it brings back to that generation. But also, it has a lot of new stuff for people of the new young generation. So in this case, I would say that Sony and Marvel Studios are being very smart to really target every generation. And that's the great thing. You target people. This has this young version of Spider-Man, which is very liked by the young generation, the ultimate version, the ultimate Spider-Man style. And you have, of course, the style of the Spider-Man, the young teen that was pretty much in the 60s, well, in the 70s, and of course beyond that. So you have this that really caters to every person, and they're very smart about it. They're just doing it smart. Now, when the movie comes out, we'll know for sure if all works out well. It's just the trailer, but the trailer was geared towards each person, each generation. And I think that's what comics should do nowadays. I think comics, you have to bring a balance. You want to cater to the young crowd, but also you want to cater to the older crowd. Of course, as a business, most people prefer to cater to the younger crowd because they foresee that they are going to be the customers for years to come. They're going to be the customers. They are going to stay in the longer run. They're going to be here for 20, 30, 45, 50 years buying their comics, and they're going to teach their kids about comics. Now, the older crowd is kind of fading out. So as that goes, the companies, what they do just to keep them happy, they keep, releasing omnibuses and hardcover collections for all of them, for all of us, for all the older geezers, so we can keep on buying their product. So it just works that way. That's the way they do it. But of course, I feel that this is the disconnect sometimes where you can see in comics where, not only, I'm not talking about the companies towards their market, but towards their customers or, their fan base. But most importantly, this is the divide between the fans. What really determines why some people prefer some things and some people don't like other things. I know a lot of people don't like some of the comic book stories I present. I know that most of my crowd is an older crowd. I can see that on my demographics. I can see that on my numbers. The vast majority of the people that like to watch my videos are my age or, around my age, and some of them are younger, but you can see the numbers that drop, the numbers drop after, I think after late 40s and the 50s, it drops because a lot of the people, most of the stuff that I present here or the stuff that I review has been stuff that I grew up reading in the 80s. In the 90s, but also stuff that is a bit within the late 70s, so anything that is within my generation, but I don't really review much of the stuff prior to that. So so a lot of people that grew up in the golden age or perhaps the silver age, they don't see value in what I do, but they don't, they understand what I read or they just don't like it, because they didn't grow up with it. It's a totally different generation. And the same happens. And most of my readers, haven't really reviewed a lot of newer stuff, which I try to do because I still read a lot of the new stuff. But a lot of my followers are not in their 20s or early 20s because my videos don't give them any value. So we have to understand this. We have to always come to this conclusion. At the end of the day, at the end of everything, we have to come to the conclusion. And this is actually, I'm coming to the end of this podcast. The generational divide is going to affect the way people perceive comics. And it's always going to be there. And you have to kind of adapt to the system. And also you have to kind of live to it. You have to live around it and live by it and, pretty much be content with it. This is something that I have learned, because for the longest I was always unsatisfied with the comics. I always expressed my opinion and I always said this and I always said that. It came to a point that I realized that it's like me is speaking to a wall. You're talking to the wall, trying to change the world. It's not going to change. You have to understand this new generation. You have to understand what they like. You have to understand that this is the way their brain operates. Doesn't mean that they're less smarter or less capable to understand. It's just they've been wired differently than my generation and they prefer art over writing. And you can hear them talking all the time. They say that. I have gone through these discussions before even on CBR, on some of those, forums where a lot of young people hang out, where they say, I prefer art. Art is more important than the writing. And to me, as a writing is more important than the art. And, people before me say art, that they prefer that. I believe more than that. I believe that there should be a balance between both. But, in my generation, writing is always more important. But, I come to the conclusion that you need to balance it. But, younger generation, they prefer the art over the writing, which really tells us that the difference, because of the generation you grew up with the timelines you live in, and what you've been geared and wired to believe in and to adapt. Nowadays everything is visual. People work visually. People do things visually. Everything people do, they do it on a tablet. They do it in a computer. So they visualize things so they can perform better. It's all about visualizing things and move on. But my generation didn't do that. My generation was all about face-to-face contact and communication, about talking to people directly. You didn't just talk to a screen, or you didn't just simply type to a screen to communicate with people. And that's something that I still do nowadays, even on my job. Sometimes, when I'm working on my job, I send emails to a lot of people because we have a big company or work on a big company. And sometimes for me it means that I have to get up and go to someone else's office just to talk directly. I'd rather do that than just simply send an email. The young bucks at my job, they don't do that. They rather just send an email and be done with it. It is just their mindset. But, what can you say in a simple email? It's not as personal or as rich as what you can say face to face. You can communicate. It's a different generation. So this is the part we have to keep in mind. You have to keep in mind. We all need to keep in mind that the generational divide causes comics to be different, and every generation is different. Doesn't mean that one is better than the other. Doesn't mean that the comics that are written nowadays are better than the comics that were written in the 60s or 70s. Even people say, well, those stories were horrible. Well, then now we're horrible. It's just simply you don't understand them. It's just not your cup of tea. That doesn't mean that there has less value and they're not as good as the stories you're reading today. Because if you ask a person that prefers the stories in the 60s or 70s, it's going to tell you that the stories you prefer or you like are horrible too. And you're never going to make him happy. You have to understand that. We all need to understand that. Once we understand that, then we can value comics for what they are. They are fun things to read, stories to love, and really things that makes us believe and make us grow. Yes, there is a difference nowadays with comics where we're more mature content, and that will be a subject for another podcast. But for the time being, we need to understand that the divide really affects the way people perceive comics, and that's the way people can never agree on where are the best stories or who are the best writers. Bottom line, that's how it is. So what do you think? What is your opinion about this? I would like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're listening to this through YouTube, or if you are listening through the different apps. Please please follow the podcast, and also share the podcast, download the podcast. All of that helps this channel and my podcast. And please consider supporting this vision of mine through my Patreon account. Anything you can do to support and help will really build this channel and this podcast. So once again, thanks for watching, and God bless you. Have a great day.